Hello, this is Warcrime Zuwu, and I would like to welcome you to my limited guide for the Brothers War. If you're new here, then thank you for joining me, and I hope you find this informative and helpful. And if you are returning, I thank you humbly for returning after you enjoyed my previous limited guide or some of my other video essay content. Expect more of that in the future, as I really like making these. Let's get right down to business. There's a few things to discuss in this set. We're going to talk about new and returning mechanics so that you understand the rules text of all the new and interesting things in this set. We're going to talk about the best cards in each color. Now again, if you're new here, my limited guides tend to focus pretty much entirely on commons and uncommons, with a brief mention of bomb rares at the end. And this is because the commons and uncommons are going to make up the majority of your deck, and they're the only cards you can really expect to see in a limited format. So they're the ones you'll want to familiarize yourself with, and ones that your understanding of will be most crucial to your success in limited. We're then going to talk about the limited archetypes, what this set wants you to play, depending on what color combination you see, the signpost commons and uncommons that exemplify what those color combos are trying to do. Showcase artifacts, which is a new thing for this set, very similar to the Mystical Archive from Strixhaven, but it's a set of artifacts that appear in every pack, and we're going to talk about which ones of those you'll want to nab over maybe a card from the main set, if it's a good one in your pack. Then we're going to go over a couple of tips and tricks, just little things to know about this limited format, and then we're going to talk about bomb rares. First, I would like to humbly request that you listen to Titania here and choose to like the video, subscribe, leave a comment with your thoughts, and share the video with a friend to help them prepare for the Brothers War Limited. I hate asking to do this, but it would really help the channel grow if people would reach out with the videos. So if you find this helpful, go ahead and share it. But with all of that out of the way, let's talk about the new mechanics and returning mechanics in the set. Here's a mechanic I'm very excited for. This is called Prototype. Now, this appears at all rarities, and it's essentially a modal mechanic that allows the creatures to be large, colorless artifact creatures, a la Rise of the Eldrazi, or small, colored artifact creatures, allowing them to fill multiple roles in a limited deck. This functions very similarly to Kicker, but it's essentially the more expensive, or I guess you could say kicked version of the spell can be played in any deck, whereas the smaller version needs to be played in a specific deck. So here I've given 3 examples. The one we're going to talk about is Rust Goliath. This is a 10 mana 10/10 construct artifact creature. Prototype for 3 and double green. And it has reach and trample, so it gets its text box regardless of which version you pick. So any abilities. But the power and toughness and color are based on whether you prototyped it or not. So if you didn't prototype it, it's a 10 mana 10/10 reach trample. If you did prototype it, it's a 5 mana 3/5 reach and trample, but it costs 3 and double green, so you have to be playing a green deck to play that cheaper cost. Typically, these are going to be 2 sort of below average effects for the cost, 2 below average bodies for the cost. Although, of course, look at this Combat Thresher in the middle. This is a white uncommon. I'd be happy casting this for 3 mana and getting the prototype, but I'd also be happy casting it for 7 mana. And these interact really interestingly with a mechanic we'll get to later, but essentially all you need to know about Prototype is that it has a cheaper colored version or a more expensive colorless version. I think the best way to represent this in paper is probably taking the card halfway out of the sleeve if you're casting it for its prototype cost, to help you remember that it's not just the basic stats of the card. Next, we've got Power Stones. Now, these were sort of sneak previewed on the Karn from the previous set, but they are a core mechanic in this set, and they are token artifacts that can tap repeatedly for colorless mana, but this mana can't be spent to cast a non-artifact spell. Now, that seems worded very weirdly. They could just say, spend this mana only to cast artifacts. But it actually also works on activated abilities. It works to pay taxes for things like Leonin Arbiter and Modern. They work for anything other than a spell that's not an artifact. They are worded that way for a reason, and you'll see a lot of these mana sink limited abilities really benefiting from the Power Stones. So here's a couple cards that make Power Stones. All the cards in this set make tapped Power Stones, but they will sort of be the backbone of allowing you to cast the more expensive versions of those prototype creatures that we just looked at. Next, we've got a returning mechanic, Unearth. Now, this one has previously only shown up on creatures, but in this set, it also shows up on non-creature artifacts in addition to artifact creatures. And as a quick reminder, Unearth is a separate cost. You pay the Unearth cost, return this card from your graveyard to the battlefield. It gains haste. Exile it at the beginning of the next end step, or if it would leave the battlefield. Unearth only as a sorcery. It's important to note that Unearth is not casting, it is activating ability. This has two very important ramifications. You can counter Unearth with things that can counter activated abilities, but you cannot counter Unearth effects with counterspells. And, also notably, the creature is in the graveyard until the Unearth ability resolves, which means if you have an effect similar to Scavenging Ooze or Lion Sash, and you can exile it in response to them activating Unearth, the creature cannot enter the battlefield. It does not go from the graveyard onto the stack when you pay the cost and then into play. It goes from the graveyard, and then it does not come into play until it resolves. It stays in the graveyard. So, with that out of the way, Unearth basically is just a mechanic where the creature can come back for one last swing. It's like flashback for creatures. And then the other returning mechanic we're not going to worry too much about for the sake of limited, although sometimes the dream will come true. Meld is a mechanic where you can flip over 2 cards into 1 on the backside. It's always very fun to get to make it happen. But in this set, all of the meld pairs are 1 mythic plus 1 rare, so you are exceedingly unlikely to get to meld any creatures in limited. But here's an example for you. Alright, we're going to start talking about the best cards in each color, and for each color I've prepared 3 commons and 3 uncommons, and we're going to read them and discuss. So for white, the 3 commons I've chosen are Prison Sentence. This is 2 and a white for an aura, enchant creature. When Prison Sentence enters the battlefield, scry 2. Enchanted creature can't attack or block, and its activated abilities can't be activated. So 3-mana pacifisms have been perfectly fine in limited formats for the past few years. This one lets you scry 2, so I think it's just, a lot better. You look at this compared to Intercessor's Arrest, which rather than scry 2 didn't allow you to crew vehicles. That doesn't really matter in this set. Not being able to attack, block, or activate your abilities pretty much takes a creature out of commission, and so the Scry 2 Rider is incredibly helpful, especially later in the game where you need to dig for gas. We've got Deadly Riposte. This is 1 and a white for an instant. Deadly Riposte deals 3 damage to target tapped creature, and you gain 3 life. This is awesome. This is... in limited, a lot of times when you're using a lightning strike, it is going to be on a creature that's attacking you. So that restriction is not that big a deal, and gaining 2 life is insane against an aggro deck. And the aggro decks in this format are going to be pretty powerful, I think. So Deadly Riposte is premium white removal again. And then we've got a non-removal spell, white common, Airlift Chaplain, 2 and a white for a 1/1 flyer. When Airlift Chaplain enters the battlefield, mill 3 cards. You may put a Plains card or a creature card with mana value 3 or less from among the cards milled this way into your hand. If you don't, put a +1/+1 counter on Airlift Chaplain. Now, this is hinting at some themes for the limited format coming up. I will jump right out of the gate and get ahead of this. This is definitely not inspiring Overseer. But I think it's worth considering for a lot of decks. It's going to mill and then potentially return something valuable, and if it doesn't, it's a 3-mana 2/2 flyer. There are a lot of things worse than a Windrake. Now we're going to talk about the 3 best white uncommons. One of these you've seen already. Lay Down Arms is a sorcery. Exile target creature with mana value less than or equal to the number of planes you control. Its controller gains 3 life. So in the mid-game, you got 6 lands out, or I guess that would be the late game. You've got 6 lands out. If half of them are planes, this can exile a 3-drop for 1 mana, and its controller gains 3 life. I'm not saying this is the best. I think this has some constructed potential. But in limited, I think I'm pretty happy taking this. We've got another removal spell, an enchantment, Static Net, 3 and a white. When Static Net enters the battlefield, exile target non-land permanent an opponent controls until Static Net leaves the battlefield. When Static Net enters the battlefield, you gain 2 life and create a tapped Power Stone token. So it's pretty obvious to me that this sort of O-Ring variant is more dedicated to the decks that are wanting to cast the higher half of those prototype spells. The Power Stone is relevant. It's a little bit higher of a cost, but it gains you 2 life to kind of keep you sweating a little less against aggro. And it's just an Oblivion Ring. And then next we've got Combat Thresher. I have to break script real quick and say I am incredibly excited to play this card in Cube. It ticks so many boxes. It synergizes with so many different options in Cube. Love this card. Combat Thresher is a 7-mana 3/3 double strike. When Combat Thresher enters the battlefield, draw a card. And you can prototype it for 2 and a white, and if you do, it's a 1/1. So a 1/1 double strike that draws you a card when it comes in for 3 mana is pretty good. That makes blocking awkward. It's an excellent thing to put +1/+1 counters or equipments or auras on. This card's great. And that's without even really looking at its higher cost, which its higher cost, a 3/3 double striker is an excellent body, and that extra card is really going to matter. So Combat Thresher, I think, is going to be awesome. Is it going to be the inspiring Overseer of the set? It's an uncommon, so I think it's going to have the same kind of effect on games as Inspiring Overseer, though, so I'm interested to see where it goes. Next, we're going to talk about the best blue cards. First, we've got Combat Courier. 1 mana for a 1/1 artifact creature construct, pay 2 and sacrifice Combat Courier, draw a card. And it unearths for a blue, so this is kind of a clue. In fact, it could have the subtype clue, I think, and be correct, but obviously clues are not a theme of this set. Anyway, so it's a 1 mana 1/1. You can maybe get 1 or 2 hits in with it before it becomes obsolete if it's in the early game, but I think the big thing is this is kind of a divination split among multiple turns. You're typically late game, you're going to be unearthing it and then immediately sacking it rather than, or maybe you swing with it first and then sack it, but it's just a source of like sort of slow card advantage. You have a little bit of mana, put it into this, eventually you'll get a card out of it, and eventually you get a second card. Mightstone's Animation, 3 and a blue for an Aura Enchant Artifact. When Mightstone's Animation enters the battlefield, draw a card. Enchanted Artifact is a creature with base power and toughness 4/4 in addition to its other types. Now, this is kind of a confusing card, but bear with me. There's a lot of ways to make Power Stones in this set, and if you have a Power Stone sitting around that you're not going to be using for anything anyway, then this Mightstone's Animation is a 4 mana 4/4 that draws a card. And that is amazing and limited. That is a sort of sneaky version of the Pizza Rhino. The Rock's Oracle is, of course, what I'm referring to. More recently, we've had Owlbear, Serulf's Packmate, just a middle-of-the-game green creature that draws a card. This is blue. You have to animate a Power Stone. I think that's what you're going to be doing this with 99% of the time. And it's just a 4/4 for 4 that draws a card. That's an amazing rate. And then we've got its sort of counterpart, Weakstone's Subjugation. This is a blue for an Aura, Enchant Artifact, or Creature. When it enters the battlefield, you may pay 3. If you do, tap Enchanted Permanent. Enchanted Permanent doesn't untap during its controller's next untap step. So this is a sort of containment sphere. It's a keep it tapped down sort of spell, but with the flexibility of only costing 1 mana if the thing is already tapped, or slap it on something that you think they're going to attack with in the future, and then they have to make that attack knowing it's going to be the last one they make with that creature. And then, of course, if you want to pay the full 4 on something they haven't been tapping themselves, then you can just do that. It's a very flexible piece of removal, so I like it. And then when we get into the blue uncommons, we have Take Flight, 3 and a blue for an Aura, Enchant Creature. Enchanted Creature gets +1/0 and flying, and whenever this creature attacks, draw a card. I think this card's sneaky good. You play it when your opponent's tapped out so that you're guaranteed to at least get 1 card off of it, replacing itself. But if you swing with it even a second time, you have given your creature some evasion, and it's been a divination. So I think Take Flight is a sneaky good card. Then we've got Spotterthopter. This is a prototype card. It's an 8 mana 4/5 flyer. When it enters the battlefield, scry X, where X is its power. But you can prototype it for 3 and a blue to make it a 2/3. So 4 mana for a 2/3. I don't think you're looking at the 8 drop costs on this most of the time, although if you got the mana lying around, if you got enough Power Stones, whatever, do it. But I think a lot of the times you're going to be evaluating this as a 4 mana 2/3 flyer that scries 2 when it comes in, and that is fine. That is pretty good. So we'll take that. And then we've got Involuntary Cooldown, 3 and a blue for a sorcery, tap up to 2 target artifacts and or creatures, put 2 stun counters on each of them. This is going to be the difference in a gummed up board state. This is, if you're trying to close out the game, it's going to make your opponent have to make some real bad blocks to stay alive. So I think it's pretty good. Next, we've got the best black cards. We're going to start with Carrion Locust as our first comment. It's 2 and a black for a 2/1 Insect Horror with flying. When Carrion Locust enters the battlefield, exile target card from an opponent's graveyard. If it was a creature card, that player loses 1 life. Now, this does not seem that exciting, although a 3 mana 2/1 flyer is never anything to scoff at. But when you consider that many of the artifact creatures with Unearth, many of the artifacts with Unearth are creatures, including one you can see on the screen right now, it becomes really, really valuable to be able to get rid of those. And having that as a rider on a decent body already is excellent. Next, we've got Overwhelming Remorse. This is 4 and a black for an instant. This spell costs 1 less to cast for each creature card in your graveyard. Exile target creature or planeswalker. You are hardly ever going to be paying 5 mana for this, but even when you do, it's not going to feel that bad. I'm thinking get 2 creatures in your graveyard on the way up to this, and then this is a 3 mana exile target creature or planeswalker at instant speed. I think this has constructed potential, I'll just say that, but I think this card is very, very good and limited. It's primo common removal. So get as many copies as you can. Gets around Unearth by exiling, that's a plus. And then speaking of Unearth, we've got Scrapwork Rager. 4 mana for an artifact creature, Phyrexian Horror, 2/2. When Scrapwork Rager enters the battlefield, you draw a card and you lose 1 life. And then you can unearth it for 3 and a black, which is, of course, going to draw you another card and lose you another life. Compared to Phyrexian Rager, a very good limited card, 3 mana 2/2, draw a card and lose a life. I don't think this is quite as good, of course, but I do think this has potential. Especially on an empty board, like replacing itself. If your opponent's not putting pressure on you, this replacing itself will help you push ahead really well. And the Unearth late in the game, just to get an extra card, is definitely appreciated. So don't sleep on that guy. And then we've got the best black uncommons. First, we've got Disciples of Gix. I think this guy's really sweet. It's a 6 mana 4/4 Phyrexian human. When it enters the battlefield, search your library for up to 3 artifact cards, put them into your graveyard, then shuffle. If you get one of these in draft, this is going to be hard to make work in sealed, but if you get 1 or 2 of these in draft, then you just pick up every Unearth artifact you can. This is going to put 3 different Unearth creatures into your yard for you to just have play after play for the next couple turns. And I think it's hard to overestimate that. Next, we've got Go for the Throat. Now, it's worth noting that so many of the creatures in this set, especially at common and uncommon, are artifacts, that this is not going to always be a hit. But Go for the Throat, for those who don't know, this is a reprint. It's 1 and a black for an instant. Destroy target non-artifact creature. So this doesn't work against those the prototype creatures. This doesn't work against the Unearth artifact creatures, but it works against anything that's not an artifact, and it's an instant. I think it's definitely worth including. It's a very good pickup. And then next we've got Ashnod's Harvester, which kind of does an impression of Graveyard Trespasser, and in a set full of Unearth, that's pretty welcome. It's a 2 mana 3/1 construct. Whenever Ashnod's Harvester attacks, exile target card from a graveyard. And then it's got Unearth 1 and a black. So it can kind of shut down your opponent's graveyard shenanigans. It's a decent blocker. It can come back with Unearth to shut down something scary with Unearth from their graveyard. If it's necessary later in the game for only 2 mana. So I think this card's amazing. This is also one of the ones that you might consider running even if you're not in black, although its utility goes down quite a bit if you can't unearth it. Next, we're going to talk about red, and their commons are pretty interesting. We're going to start with Conscripted Infantry, 2 and a red for a 3/1 human soldier. When it dies, make a 1/1 colorless soldier artifact creature token. So 3 mana 3/1 is going to trade evenly with other 3-drops, and it's going to leave behind a 1/1 body, and there's not much more you can ask from a common. Then we've got Unleash Shell, which is 3 and double red for an instant. 5 damage to target creature or planeswalker, and 2 damage to that permanent's controller. Not premium removal, but this does answer a lot of things, and getting to burn your opponent for a little bit is going to matter in those aggressive decks. This is going to maybe be like a top-end removal spell for unclogging the board state and getting a little bit of damage to the face. Then we've got Excavation Explosion, 2 and a red for a sorcery. Excavation Explosion deals 3 damage to any target. Create a tapped Power Stone token. So this is awesome removal. Clears up whatever the most dangerous early game creature is, and then gives you that Power Stone to maybe help you ramp into casting one of your high-cost prototypes in the late game. Now we've got our red uncommons. This is an amazing aggro card. Giant Cindermaw, 2 and a red for a 4/3 dinosaur beast with trample, and players can't gain life. They're putting this effect on a lot more cards lately, and I think it's interesting for limited. It's definitely going to try to prevent your opponent from stabilizing against your aggro deck, and it's just an above-curve creature, so I'm definitely happy to have these. Next, we've got another very good removal spell, Obliterating Bolt, 1 and a red for a sorcery, deals 4 damage to target creature or planeswalker. If that creature or planeswalker would die this turn, exile it instead. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe this is a strictly better Lava Coil, because it's a Lava Coil that can hit planeswalkers. There was a spell that was like this that could hit planeswalkers in addition to creatures, and then there was a spell that was like this that exiled, and they just kind of smushed them together, and now you get both effects. You can hit a creature or a planeswalker, and you can exile it. Of course, that Planeswalker Rider is not very relevant and limited at all, but Lava Coil was always a great card to see. It's going to be great here too, and worth noting, this shuts down Unearth. Speaking of Unearth, we've got Mishra's Research Desk. Now, this is not a artifact creature, but it is an artifact with Unearth. So it's 1 mana for an artifact. You can pay 1, tap, and sacrifice Mishra's Research Desk. Exile the top 2 cards of your library. Choose one of them. Until the end of your next turn, you may play that card. And then it's got Unearth for 1 and a red. So until the end of your next turn is very important to this card. Whatever you get, you are guaranteed to be able to untap and play that card. So even if you like turn 2 crack this, pick a land, turn 3 unearth it and crack it again, turn 4 is the limit for when you can play that card. So this can really help you set up in the early game if your opponent's not doing anything and you have kind of a rough hand. Or late in the game, this is insane card selection for the mana cost. So Mishra's Research Desk I think is going to be a great pickup and a bit of a sleeper. And then last but not least is the color green. So we've got a reprint of Epic Confrontation at common. This is 1 and a green for sorcery. Target creature you control gets +1/+2 until end of turn. It fights target creature you don't control. So this is very powerful for a removal spell. Obviously, you basically just get to kill something and then your creature swings in for a little more of that turn. So who doesn't love Epic Confrontation? Next we got Tomahawk Honor Guard, another common. 1 and a green for a 3/1 human soldier with Ward 2. This card blocks excellent. This card swings fine, although there's a lot of 1/1s floating around in this set. But the Ward 2 prevents it from like getting pinged by something that deals 1 damage to any target for free. So I think this card's great to pick up. And then we've got Shoot Down. 3 and a green for a sorcery. Exile target artifact, enchantment, or creature with flying. Now, normally you don't want to play these in your main board, but there are so many artifacts in this set, especially both high-cost ones, which you're glad to answer with a 4-mana sorcery, and unearth ones, which you're glad to exile with your removal. So I think Shoot Down is a lot better than it would be in most sets. And then next we've got our green uncommons. We've got Bushwhack, a sorcery, with choose 1. Search your library. It's a single green. Choose 1. Search your library for a basic land, reveal it, put it in your hand, then shuffle. Or target creature you control fights target creature you don't control. So I think this is going to typically just be a 1-mana fight spell, which you're pretty happy to play, but it lets you keep a rough hand too. You have a hand that's just like a forest, and this grabs your second basic land, and then you just need to draw a third one in your life. Next we've got Audacity, which is a play on a classic card that I love from original Urza's block called Rancor. This one is Audacity, single green, aura, enchant creature. Enchanted creature gets +2/+0 and has trample. When Audacity is put into a graveyard from the battlefield, draw a card. And then the flavor text, Bravery outlives the brave, is a reference to Rancor's original flavor text, Hatred outlives the hateful. But essentially what Rancor would do was instead of drawing a card when it went away, it would return to your hand. Is that better than this? Probably, just because you could continue to be guaranteed to have that +2/0 and trample, but Audacity is a great card to slap on your creature. Don't do it when your opponent has mana open, and it's important to remember that ability to draw a card does not trigger if the creature dies in response to Audacity being cast, because Audacity never hits the battlefield, but remember those things, and this card will serve you pretty well. Now we've got a crazy uncommon reprint. This was previously a rare in, I believe, both the 2 sets it's been printed in. Correct me if I'm wrong in the comments, but this is Obstinate Baloth, 2 and double green for a beast. When Obstinate Baloth enters the battlefield, you gain 4 life. It's a 4/4. And if a spell or ability an opponent controls would cause you to discard it, put it onto the battlefield instead of putting it into your graveyard. So this still counts as discarding for purposes of Kroxa, Pioneer players, but this card's legal in Pioneer now, which it was not before. In Standard, you plus Lily, and your opponent puts in an Obstinate Baloth instead of actually discarding a card, and you just feel awful. So this card is counterplay to cards that a lot of people have been complaining about for a little while, but it's also just very good and limited. 4-mana 4/4s are not bad. 4-mana 4/4s that gain 4 life are an aggro deck's worst nightmare, so you're going to be happy to get as many of these as you can. So those are the best commons and uncommons in each color, but now we're going to discuss the limited archetypes and what I think the different decks in this format are going to be trying to do. We're going to start with the ally color pairs as usual, starting with white-blue soldiers. So Yoshin Tactician is the signpost uncommon for the set. 4-mana 3/4 human soldier. Other soldiers you control get +1/+1. And then we've got Aeronaut Cavalry, 4 and a white for a 3/4 human soldier flying. When it enters the battlefield, put a 1/1 counter on another target soldier you control. And then Zephyr Sentinel, 1 and a blue for a 2/1 flash flyer at uncommon. When Zephyr Sentinel enters the battlefield, return up to 1 other target creature you control to its owner's hand. If it was a soldier, put a +1/+1 counter on Zephyr Sentinel. So you want to go with a creature that you sort of already has like an enter the battlefield trigger or is about to get killed by a removal spell. And then you get a 3/2 flyer with flash. So this deck is just about going wide. It's a soldier tribal. Tribal is one of the sort of more intuitive decks to play in limited. And you just get all the soldiers you can and all the soldiers matter cards you can. Next, we've got blue-black card draw matters. Shout out to Denman Rook for this sick art on Evangel of Synthesis, one of my favorite arts in the set. But you may recognize this limited theme from Throne of Eldraine a few years ago. It was in blue-red. Now it's in blue-black, and it makes as much sense there. Essentially, all of these cards give you some sort of bonus when you draw your second card each turn. Typically, this is going to be done via looting or similar, but you draw your card for turn, and then you draw your second card via some effect, and you get a rider. In the case of Evangel of Synthesis, it's a 2-mana 2/3 Phyrexian Human Cleric. When it enters the battlefield, you lose, so it's immediately going to trigger all your other guys. As long as you've drawn 2 or more cards this turn, Evangel of Synthesis has +1/0 and Menace, and 3/3 Menace for 2 is a great body, so if you can keep that rider up, or if you can keep that condition up, rather, you've got that amazing body. And then you've got Thopter Mechanic, 2-mana 2/1. Whenever you draw your second card each turn, put a 1/1 counter on Thopter Mechanic. And when it dies, you make a 1/1 colorless Thopter with flying. So, just a great card. 2-mana 2/1 that makes a 1/1 flyer when it dies is already great. But if you ever happen to draw an extra card, it just gets a 1/1 counter. And then you've got Gurgling Anointer, 2 and a black for a 1/3 Phyrexian Horror with flying. Whenever you draw your second card each turn, put a 1/1 counter on Gurgling Anointer, and when Gurgling Anointer dies, return another target creature card with mana value less than or equal to its power from your graveyard to the battlefield. That is Gurgling Anointer's power, of course. So, fairly simple deck to construct. You're going to want to prioritize things that let you loot, or just draw a card cheaply, cantrip, stuff like that, to make this work. Next, we've got Black-Red Sack. Now, this is creature and artifact sack, but this is a deck that many are probably familiar with if they've played a little bit of Limited in the past few years. This is what Black-Red has done in a lot of sets. Junkyard Genius, 3-mana 2/2, is the Signpost uncommon. When it enters the battlefield, you make a tapped Power Stone, and you can pay 3, sack another creature or artifact. Until end of turn, other creatures you control get +1/0 and gain Menace and Haste. And then you've got Gixian Infiltrator, 2-mana 2/1. Whenever you sack another permanent, put a 1/1 counter on Gixian Infiltrator. Seems pretty good. And then you got Pendragon Strongbull, 2 and a red for a 2/3 Minotaur. Pay 1 and sack an artifact. Pendragon Strongbull gets +1/+1 until end of turn and deals 1 damage to each opponent. I think this card actually gets crazy if you have a decently reliable way to make Power Stones, because those Power Stones can tap themselves for the mana to activate this. So it basically becomes sack an untapped Power Stone. And you can do this at instant speed, so you can swing, and if they decide to block, sack a couple Power Stones, make Pendragon big enough to win that trade, and do a little damage to their face. So I think this card is pretty good. Next we got Red-Green Ramp Aggro. This feels like the least well-defined archetype in terms of what it's trying to do, but it is essentially a Power Stone ramp deck with a little bit of burst potential. We've got Arbalest Engineers, 3-mana 2/2. When it enters the battlefield, choose 1. I love that text. Deals 1 damage to any target. Put a +1/+1 counter on target creature, gains trample and haste until end of turn, or create a tapped Power Stone token. So worth noting, it can target itself. It can be a 3/3 trample haste, which is a great body for 3 mana. But making that Power Stone token if you've got big plays you're planning on, or killing their 3/1 if they've got like a 3/1 out or a 2/1. All worthwhile goals. So Arbalest Engineers is an amazing uncommon. And we've got Horned Stoneseeker, 2-mana 2/2 Lizard with Menace. When it enters the battlefield, make a tapped Power Stone, and when it leaves the battlefield, sack a Power Stone. So this kind of synergizes with the artifact sack deck in that, like, if you can sack the Power Stone, you don't get the drawback when this dies. But this is kind of a mana dork. It's 2/2 Menace, and the mana is sort of detached from it in the form of a Power Stone. But it does go away when it dies. And then you've got Argothian Sprite, 2 and a green for a 2/2 Fairy. Can't be blocked by artifact creatures, which is actually quite relevant in this format. A lot of the creatures you're going to be seeing are artifact creatures, but you can pay 7 mana to put 2 +1/+1 counters on Argothian Sprite. That's very powerful with Power Stones, obviously, because those Power Stones are going to be sitting around in some turns if you don't have an artifact spell to spend them on, and an activated ability like this that just lets you pump some mana in to permanently make this creature bigger is going to be really, really helpful. And then next we've got Green-White Artifact Aggro. The Signpost uncommon is Yoshin Dissident. Green and a white for a 1/1 Human Artificer. Whenever an artifact enters the battlefield under your control, put a 1/1 counter on target creature you control. So anytime you make a Power Stone, which is, a lot of the time, that's going to be what the artifact is, this puts a counter on your biggest thing, or your most evasive thing, or itself if you don't have anything else. So, you get to spread the love in terms of those +1/+1 counters. I think this is a powerful uncommon. And to pair with it, we've chosen Serenth Steelseeker, 2 mana, 1/2, Human Artificer Scout. Whenever an artifact enters the battlefield under your control, look at the top card of your library. If it's a land card, you may reveal it and put it in your hand. If you don't put the card in your hand, you may put it in your graveyard. And then we've got Phalanx Vanguard, 1 and a white for a 2/2 Vigilance. Whenever an artifact enters the battlefield under your control, Phalanx Vanguard gets +1/0 until end of turn. And this is a common human soldier, sorry. So yeah, make Power Stones or play cheap Unearth artifact creatures and give yourself those +1/+1 counters. Give yourself those benefits. Play a sort of go wide aggro deck with a little bit of value built in. Moving on to the enemy pairs, we've got white-black 3 or less. This is a very interesting archetype. We don't see things like this all the time, so this one's pretty unique. We've got Hero of the Dunes, 3 a white and a black for a 3/2 human soldier. When Hero of the Dunes enters the battlefield, return target artifact or creature card with mana value 3 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield. Creatures you control with mana value 3 or less get +1/+0. So it's sort of a lord for creatures that cost 3 or less, and it reanimates something when it comes in. This card's great. This is also the kind of archetype that you don't really have to think that much about building a deck around because you're going to be playing cards that cost 3 or less anyway. One of the other cards is Recruitment Officer. It's a white for a 2/1 human soldier. You can pay 4, look at the top 4 cards of your library. You may reveal a creature card with mana value 3 or less from among them and put it in your hand. Put the rest on the bottom of your library and in a random order. And again, Power Stones can help pay for this, which is huge. And if you've just got 8 mana laying around, you can activate this twice. This doesn't require you to tap or anything. So Savannah Lions with a pretty decent upside. Very, very great and limited. And then we've got No One Left Behind. This is a 5 mana sorcery, 4 and a black. This spell costs 3 less to cast if it targets a creature with mana value 3 or less, so it's only 2 mana to reanimate something with 3 or less. Return target creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield. The other cool thing you can do with this is you can play a card as its prototype, and then once it dies, you can No One Left Behind it and reanimate it as its full cost. Next, we've got Blue-Red Spellslinger, also a very popular archetype, one they tend to return to, I think, like every other set. But this uncommon's really, really cracked. It's Third Path Iconoclast, a blue and a red for a 2/1 human monk. Whenever you cast a non-creature spell, make a 1/1 colorless soldier artifact creature token. This is Young Pyromancer, the only difference being that the creatures are artifacts, and it costs a blue and a red rather than just 1 and a red. I think this card's got a ton of potential, so very, very cool to see it printed here. But in Limited, you put as many instants and sorceries as you can in your deck. If you get 1 off of this, then you paid 2 mana for a 2/1 and 1/1, which is great. If you just curve this into a 3-drop removal spell, you're golden. We've also got Wing Commando, which is just a 3 mana 2/2 flying prowess. So, a slightly buffer, just like a Windrake with upside. But, it cares about those instants and sorceries. So, crack that removal spell and get going. And then we've got Dwarven Forge Chanter, 1 and a red for a 1/3 prowess. Or Dwarf Wizard, also a common. And it's got Ward Pay 2 life. So this is a quintessential aggro creature. You're going to be triggering prowess off your removal spells so you can hit them for more damage. And if they want to get rid of this, they got to pay 2 life, which is not nothing. Next, we've got Black-Green. Undergrowth is not the official name, but these care about the number of creature cards in your graveyard. And that's what Undergrowth was in Guilds of Ravnica. So, Skyfisher Spider is the signpost uncommon. It's 4 mana, 2 a black and a green for a 3/3 spider with reach. When it enters the battlefield, you may sacrifice another creature. When you do, destroy target non-land permanent. When Skyfisher Spider dies, you may gain 1 life for each creature card in your graveyard. If you do, exile Skyfisher Spider from your graveyard. So interestingly, you can choose not to do that if for some reason you want to reanimate it later, but you can sack a little guy when it comes in to destroy target non-land permanent, which is great. This card's insane. Then we've got Battlefield Butcher. This is 2 and a black for a 1/4 human soldier. You can pay 5 and tap. Each opponent loses 2 life, which honestly in a long game is just great either way, but this ability costs 1 less to activate for each creature card in your graveyard. So if you're activating this for 1 or even 2, you feel fine. And if you're activating this for free, this is going to kill your opponent pretty quick. So great card to have. Next we've got Gaia's Courser. 4 and a green for a 4/5 Centaur Soldier. When Gaia's Courser attacks, if there are 3 or more creature cards in your graveyard, draw a card. So this is just great. You mill yourself, or you let some creatures die in the early game, and you've got a 5 mana 4/5 that draws a card when it swings. Very, very good. Apologize for that sneeze. Next, we've got Red White or Boros Classic Aggro. This is just a go wide aggro deck, and this Signpost Uncommon really exemplifies that. We've got a 2/3 human soldier for 4 with first strike. Whenever Falagi, Vanguard, or another creature enters the battlefield under your control, target creature gets +2/+0 until end of turn. So, worth noting, this can target itself, or it can target your other guys. When it comes in, it's going to immediately add to your swing for that turn by buffing another guy, and then when another guy comes in, it's usually going to target itself because it's got first strike, so it's a great creature to buff. But you can spread those buffs if you just need to get in for that last bit of damage in a gummed up board state. Then we've got Scrapwork Mutt, 2 mana, 2/1 artifact creature dog. When it enters the battlefield, you can discard a card. If you do, draw a card, and it's got Unearth for 1 and a red, so great to see. And then we've got Warlord's Elite, 2 and a white for a 4/4 human soldier. As an additional cost to cast the spell, tap 2 untapped artifacts, creatures, and or lands you control. So you have to be going wide, but then you can get a slightly discounted creature, 3 mana, 4/4, which is great to see. Then we've got Green-Blue Power Stone Ramp. And this is, I believe, the last of the archetypes. Battery Bearer is the Signpost Uncommon. It's 2, a green and a blue for a 3/4 human artificer. Creatures you control have tap, add a colorless. This mana can't be spent to cast a non-artifact spell. So, essentially, creatures you control double as Power Stones. And whenever you cast an artifact spell with mana value 6 or greater, draw a card. So anytime you cast the big half of one of those prototypes, you're going to be drawing a card. Pretty great. Then we've got Falagi Excavation. Now, this card does not do much unless you're trying to ramp up to one of those guys, but if you're trying to ramp up to one of those guys, it's hard to do better than this. It's 3 and double green for a sorcery. Create 3 tapped Power Stone tokens. You gain 3 life. So for 5 mana, you're going to have access to at least 8 mana next turn to cast one of those big guys. And you're also going to gain 3 life to kind of stave off aggro before you cast your big guy. And then we've got Urza, Power Stone Prodigy, Baby Urza. 2 and a white for a 1/3 human artificer with Vigilance, legendary, I guess if that matters. You can pay 1 tap, draw a card, then discard a card. Everybody loves to loot, but also when you discard 1 or more artifact cards, you make a tapped Power Stone. This ability triggers only once each turn. So what's awesome about this guy, he can get your unearthed artifacts into the graveyard to be unearthed, so it doesn't even feel like you're discarding a card. And he makes Power Stones, which will let you more easily cast those 8 drops or whatever later in the game. So now we're going to talk briefly about the top uncommon showcase cards that you might want to consider taking rather than whatever uncommons or rare is in your pack normally. As a reminder, these showcase cards do not change their legality by being in the set. It is exactly like they worked with the Mystical Archive in Strixhaven. But Foundry Inspector, Mishra's Bauble, Self-Assembler, Soul Guide Lantern, Jalum Tome, Burnished Heart. I'm not going to read what all the cards do. They're reprints. They're worth considering. Talking about just a couple tips and tricks real quick. First of all, just kind of the way that Unearth works with Power Stones. Unearth happens to only be on artifact creatures in this set anyway, but remembering Unearth is not casting the spell. You can tap Power Stones for it because they can be spent on anything other than casting a non-artifact spell. So you can tap Power Stones for Unearth, and you can tap Power Stones to hard cast artifact creatures. And then Prototype, just kind of the nitty-gritty of the way this ability works. The Prototype creature is seen to have its normal stats and its normal mana cost anywhere other than the battlefield or the stack. If you cast it for its Prototype cost, then on the stack, it is mana value of, in the case of Depth Charge Colossus here, 6 and stats of 6/6. And then when it's on the battlefield, it's stats of 6/6. But as soon as it dies, when it goes to the graveyard, in the graveyard, it's back to being a 9-drop with 9 power and toughness. The other thing to remember is if it checks power and toughness on dying for some reason, if it has to check how much power it had when it died, it uses the power that it had on the field, not in the graveyard. So if you prototyped it, in this case, it would be 6. So just something to keep track of. We're going to go over the best bombs now. Of course, this is one I would like to dwell on very little, just because, you're unlikely to see one of these necessarily, and bombs are a lot easier to identify than the more nuanced, like, what the best commons and uncommons are. But Worm Coil Engine is one of the retro artifacts. It's a 6-mana 6/6 Phyrexian Worm with Death Touch and Lifelink. When it dies, you make a 3/3 with Death Touch and a 3/3 with Lifelink. Definitely the best first pick you can possibly make in this set. Goes in literally any deck, and very close to just wins you the game. Teferi Temporal Pilgrim also probably just wins you the game. It's a 5-mana 4 Loyalty Planeswalker. Whenever you draw a card, put a loyalty counter on Teferi. That includes for your turn or by any other ability. His 0, which is really a +1 because of that aforementioned ability, is draw a card. His -2, you make a 2/2 blue spirit with vigilance, and whenever you draw a card, put a +1/+1 counter on this creature. Then -12, target opponent chooses a permanent they control and returns it to its owner's hand. Then they shuffle each non-land permanent they control into its owner's library. So, just great. You make a guy to protect him, and then you draw an extra card every turn, and he and the guy keep getting bigger. Very, very strong. Next, we've got Titania's Command. I had to really fight myself not to put all 5 of the commands on this list, but there's a new cycle of commands, which it's harder for me to be excited about anything in Magic more than a new cycle of commands. But for those of you who don't know, commands are instants or sorceries that say choose 2 on them and list 4 abilities from which you get to choose 2. Titania's Command in particular is 4 and double green for a sorcery. Choose 2. Exile target player's graveyard. You gain 1 life for each card exiled this way. Or search your library for up to 2 land cards, put them on the battlefield tapped, then shuffle. Or create 2 2/2 green bear creature tokens. Or put 2 +1/+1 counters on each creature you control. So in Limited, I think far and away the most likely thing you're going to be doing is making the 2 bears and then putting 2 1/1 counters on each creature you control, which, even if you have no other creatures out, you're making 2 4/4s for 6 mana. But if you do have more creatures out, you're making even more than that. Or you can forego one of those modes if your opponent has a graveyard full of unearthed creatures to get rid of all those unearthed creatures and gain a ton of life. Or if you are really, really trying to ramp up to a prototype creature, you can make some bears and fetch 2 lands and put them in tap. Just a lot of possibilities with this card. Hard to overlook. Next, another command, Gix's Command, 3 and double black for a sorcery. Choose 2, put 2 1/1 counters on up to 1 creature. It gains lifelink until end of turn. Destroy each creature with power 2 or less. Return up to 2 creature cards from your graveyard to your hand. Each opponent sacrifices a creature with the highest power among creatures they control. So, this card's obviously insane and limited. You can make them sack their biggest thing and then return the 2 best creatures from your yard to your hand. You can wipe the board of little guys and make your big guy ready to swing in and have lifelink. Any combination of these 4, very, very powerful. Next, we've got Tyrant of Kerr Ridges, which is one of the most powerful red rares since Glorybringer. Probably not quite as good as Glorybringer because it costs 1 more mana, but 4 and double red for a 4/5 dragon with flying. When it enters the battlefield, it deals 4 damage to any target. So, if you need to put some pressure on your opponent, you can hit him in the face or kill whatever their best thing is that 4 damage can deal with. And then for a red, you can give it +1/+0 until end of turn. So, this card's amazing. It's going to be better than pretty much anything. Unless your choice is between this and Worm Coil Engine, you should be picking this pack 1. And then Mirel Shield of Argive is 3 and a white for a 3/4 human soldier, legendary. During your turn, your opponents can't cast spells or activate abilities of artifacts, creatures, or enchantments. Relatively useful. And then whenever Mirel attacks, create X 1/1 colorless soldier artifact creature tokens, where X is the number of soldiers you control. So she's like a Cranko for soldiers when she swings. Very, very good. And then we've got just a couple more. We've got Mishra, Tamer of Makfawa. 3, a black and a red for a 4/4 human artificer. Permanents you control have ward, sacrifice a permanent. Now that includes him. Anytime that your opponent wants to target any of your permanents, including him, they have to sacrifice a permanent in order to do so. And then it also gives all the artifacts in your graveyard Unearth for 1, a black and a red. Now imagine discarding one of those prototype cards early in the game. You get Mishra out, next turn you pay 1, a black and a red, reanimate it for its full power, and destroy. Just destroy your opponent. Very, very powerful. And then we've got 2 cards that are kind of mirrors to each other. We've got Clay Champion, which is X and 4. So you have to at least spend 4 mana into it, but you can spend more if you want. That's a 2/2 construct. Clay Champion enters the battlefield with 3+1/+1 counters on it for each double green spent to cast it. And when it enters the battlefield, choose up to 2 other target creatures you control. For each double white spent to cast it, put a +1/+1 counter on each of them. So if you cast this for double green, double white, it's going to be a 5/5, and you're going to put a two +1/+1 counters, or sorry, 1+1/+1 counter on each of your other two of your other creatures. So very, very, very good if you're in a green-white deck specifically. But certainly worth playing even if you're just in a green-blue deck or a white-red deck or whatever. And then we've got Blade Coil Serpent. Now, this is sort of the counterpart for Grixis, but keep in mind, you can play this in a deck that's just 2 of those colors and do great. It's X and 6 for a 5/4 Serpent. When it enters the battlefield, for each double blue spent to cast it, draw a card. When it enters the battlefield, for each double black spent to cast it, each opponent discards a card. When Blade Coil Serpent enters the battlefield, for each double red spent to cast it, it gets +1/0 and gains trample and haste until end of turn. Now, we're going to imagine worst case scenario, you're in a deck only playing 2 of these colors, and you don't have 4 of one and 2 of the other to take maximum advantage. Let's say you just have double red, or triple red and triple black. This is a 6/5 trample haste, or 6/4 trample haste, and your opponent discards a card for 6 mana. That's amazing. And that's like worst case scenario where you can still cast this. Even if you are only playing 1 of these colors, this is definitely worth playing. If you can spend 4 blue on it, it's a 6 mana 5/4 that draws 2 cards, which, amazing. It's a pretty good Maul Drifter. So those are the best bombs in my opinion. I want to know what you guys have to say about this format. What do you think? Do you think this format's going to be good? Do you think it's going to be similar to Rise of the Eldrazi, where you're trying to use Power Stones to power out these huge artifact creatures? Do you think it's going to be an artifact or an aggro format? I'm really excited for this one. I don't think it's going to be like Dominaria United, where it's just domain soup versus like 3 different aggro decks. I think there's going to be a ton of variation in terms of the decks you can play, and I'm just really, really, really excited to get my hands on some Brothers War and play some Brothers War Limited. But let me know in the comments, did you find this helpful? What are you excited to play in this format? What cards did I maybe overlook or miss? What cards do you think I overrated? I love feedback, and I want to thank you earnestly for sitting and watching this video, and I hope you found it helpful. And I hope you have an excellent pre-release, excellent drafts thereafter, and just an excellent night. Thank you for watching, and goodbye.